I have been the primary support for my sister, who has multiple sclerosis, for the past 8 years, and now her deadbeat ex-husband is back in the picture with a suspicious nonprofit. Some background. My sister Maya was diagnosed with MS about 9 years ago. It was devastating for her and her daughter Zoe. Her husband Dan abandoned them 6 months after her diagnosis. He left them with no financial support and disappeared. Since then, I've stepped in as a surrogate parent. I've helped Maya with medical appointments, household expenses, and been there for Zoe through important milestones: middle school graduation, first dance, learning to drive. I'm not trying to sound like a martyr, but it's been a lot as Maya's condition has progressed. 3 months ago, I relocated from Chicago to Boston to be closer to them. Maya's condition worsened, and Zoe is a part-time caregiver. I took a pay cut to transfer within my company. I found an apartment 15 minutes from their place, and we settled into a routine with weekly family dinners and me helping whenever needed. Everything was fine until 2 weeks ago when Dan returned, claiming he'd found purpose and wanted to reconnect. I got a call from Maya saying Dan had reached out and wanted to meet them. I immediately suspected something, but Maya seemed cautiously optimistic, and Zoe was desperate to see her dad again. I arrived at Maya's house for dinner, and Dan was sitting at the kitchen table in a suit. Maya was smiling. She introduced Dan like he was a new friend from physical therapy rather than the husband who abandoned her. Zoe moved around the kitchen, listening to everything Dan said. During dinner, Dan described his transformation and his new nonprofit for families affected by MS. He said he'd spent years finding himself and coming to terms with his mistakes. He wants Maya and Zoe to be the public faces of his foundation. He described fundraising events, awareness campaigns, speeches Maya could give, and said Zoe's perspective as the child of someone with MS would be incredibly powerful for donors. I asked questions about his qualifications to run a nonprofit and what he'd been doing for the past 8 years. The mood changed. Maya gave me a please behave look. Dan explained he's been connecting with wealthy donors who believe in his vision and studying nonprofit management. I noticed his expensive watch and tailored clothes. Meanwhile, Maya has been saving money, and I've been helping with Zoe's school expenses. When I asked about the back child support he owes, he waved it off as water under the bridge and said his foundation would more than make up for it. After dinner, Zoe pulled me into the hallway. "Why are you being like this?" she said. "You're trying to ruin everything. He's back, and he wants to be in our lives again. Can't you just be supportive instead of questioning everything?" That hurt, especially since I've been there for everything while he was gone. I helped Maya with her evening medications while Dan entertained Zoe in the living room. He promised a trip to New York to meet donors, a new laptop, and maybe a car when she gets her license, none of which they can afford. When we were alone, Maya admitted that Dan hadn't paid any back support but said she believes this foundation will provide the financial stability they've never had. "He seems different," she said. "People can change, right?" I drove home feeling torn. I want to protect my sister and niece from what seems like a con. The timing is suspicious, and his sudden interest in MS advocacy makes no sense. I worry he's running a scam, but who am I to take away their hope? Maya hasn't looked that happy in years, and Zoe finally has her dad back. Edit: I just got off the phone with a friend who works in nonprofit management. There's no record of Dan's foundation being registered, despite him claiming it's accepting donations. I haven't confronted Dan with what I've learned about his supposed foundation yet. I'm worried about crushing Maya and Zoe's newfound happiness, but I also can't stand by and watch them potentially get hurt again. Any advice on how to handle this without blowing up my relationship with my sister and niece would be appreciated. Now for the first update. Wow, I did not expect my post to get this much attention. Thank you all for the advice and support. I've been reading every comment, even if I couldn't respond to everyone. It's been 2 weeks since Dan reappeared in my sister's life, and things have moved faster than I expected. Dan has integrated himself into Maya and Zoe's routine. He rented an apartment 3 blocks away in the same neighborhood. According to Maya, he has started the paperwork for his foundation and secured an office space downtown. I did some research after a commenter suggested I look up nonprofit regulations. This isn't Dan's first attempt at charitable ventures. I found records of 2 previous attempts. One was meant to help veterans with PTSD 4 years ago, and another focused on literacy for underprivileged kids 2 years ago. Neither moved beyond initial paperwork, but both had websites with donation buttons that stayed active for months. I couldn't find any financial records for those funds. Maya agreed to be the spokesperson for his MS Foundation. She said it would give her purpose. Dan has scheduled several photo shoots and arranged speaking engagements, which concerns me given her health limitations. Yesterday evening, I stopped by Maya's house unannounced with groceries and prepared meals. When I arrived, Dan was in the living room directing a professional photographer taking pictures of Maya. They had positioned Maya in her wheelchair, which she uses only on her worst days, with makeup that highlighted her dark circles and pale skin. Her hair was not in its usual style, and she wore one of her older sweaters instead of her typical photo clothes. Dan told the photographer, "Get a shot of her looking at her hands. The tremors tell the story." He seemed irritated when he saw me with groceries, but then smiled. "Look who's here. We're just wrapping up promotional materials for donors." I set the groceries down and asked Maya, "What's going on here? I didn't know you had a photo shoot scheduled today." I tried to keep my tone neutral. Dan stepped between us. "We're creating materials that resonate with donors. They need to see the reality of MS. It's just marketing. You wouldn't understand." Maya said, "It's fine. I'm just a little tired from the session. We've been at it for about 2 hours. Maya can barely handle 30 minutes of activity on her bad days without needing rest." The photographer stood back as I helped Maya move from the wheelchair to the couch, where she struggled to settle. Dan pulled me into the kitchen and said, "I know what you're doing, but you need to understand that things are different now. Maya and Zoe have me back. They don't need you around all the time. It's making Zoe uncomfortable." I said, "I'm concerned about the way you're portraying Maya. She's always hated being defined by her illness. What about compensation for her role? What's the foundation's structure and who is on the board?" Dan said, "There you go again, making problems where there aren't any. Maya is an adult who can make her own decisions. Maybe you're just worried about not being needed anymore." Then he went back to the living room. After the photographer left, Maya needed to rest, so I spent some time with Zoe in her room. She was excited to show me the website for the foundation. The site had black and white photos of Maya and a narrative about Zoe's experience as the child of an MS warrior. Their stories were featured, but there was minimal information about programs, services, or the financial structure. When I scrolled to the bottom, there was already a Donate Now button active. "Did you write this piece about your experience?" I asked Zoe. She shook her head and said Dan had written it for her because he knows what donors want to hear. I kept that thought to myself. Later, while helping Maya get ready for bed, I brought up the website and the photo shoot. Maya said she'd signed paperwork giving Dan permission to use her image and story, but hadn't read the documents carefully. "He explained most of it, and I trust him," she said. "He's really changed. He's trying to make things right." I asked if she had copies of what she signed. She didn't. This morning, Dan texted asking to meet privately to clear the air. He said he values my role in Maya and Zoe's lives and wants us to work together for their benefit. He suggested coffee tomorrow afternoon. Per questions from my last post, 1. There's still no record of the foundation being registered. 2. Dan hasn't mentioned the back child support he owes. 3. Maya has a lawyer who handled her divorce but hasn't consulted them about this. I'm feeling uneasy about this situation. Dan has moved quickly back into their lives, exploited Maya's condition for these photos, and activated a donation button for an unregistered charity. Seeing how Zoe reacts to him is the worst part. She's wanted her dad back for so long that she doesn't see what I see as manipulation. Some of you suggested I reach out to Dan's ex-partners from his previous charities. I've also contacted a friend who works as a financial investigator to see if there are public records about what happened to the money from those failed ventures. Should I meet with Dan tomorrow as he requested, or is that a mistake? I don't want to seem uncooperative to Maya and Zoe, but every interaction with Dan makes me feel manipulated. Edit. I found something else concerning. On social media, Dan has been posting about his MS Foundation for 6 months before he contacted Maya. There are fundraising posts from 3 months ago promising programs that don't exist. He has been planning this. Thanks for your support and advice. I'm trying to protect Maya and Zoe without pushing them away. I'll update after meeting with Dan or once I have more information about his previous ventures. Now for the second update. Some of you guessed Dan's true intentions when I posted last week. Your comments about the charity guy who's in it for himself were accurate. I've got a lot to share about the past few weeks, so I'll lay it all out here. I met Dan for coffee after my last update, thanks to everyone who gave advice. He showed up dressed up. He talked about his plans for the foundation and how it would fund Zoe's college. He He brought a folder with mock-ups of fundraising events and brochures featuring Maya's story. "I know we got off on the wrong foot," he said, "but we both want what's best for Maya and Zoe." I noted the inconsistencies. When I asked specific questions about the foundation's finances, he responded with emotional appeals about healing the family and making up for lost time. I left the meeting and decided to gather more information. Over the past 3 weeks, Dan has pushed the foundation forward. He held a launch event last weekend at a downtown hotel. Maya was presented as the evening's inspiration, despite her flare-up the day before. Dan said her presence was essential for donor engagement. I stayed by her side while he spoke to donors. A friend in financial investigation found disturbing info about Dan's previous charitable ventures. He has a pattern: start a project, collect investments, make promises, and then disappear before delivering any services. Both previous organizations were dissolved due to administrative issues, but not before Dan took substantial consulting fees for himself. I've brought up my concerns with Maya, but she says, "You don't understand how much Zoe needs this relationship with her father." I'm not a parent, but I was there when he left 8 years ago, so I'm cautious. I was at work when I got a call from Zoe. She sounded upset but wouldn't say why and asked if I could come to the foundation office after school. I left work early because of that. When I arrived at the office, I saw an expensive setup for a foundation with little funding. Zoe was sitting alone and crying. I heard voices coming from behind Dan's office door. When I asked Zoe what happened, she said she'd overheard Dan on the phone. He said, "Trust me, the sicker she looks, the more they'll donate. We just need to emphasize the wheelchair and downplay her good days." Dan's office door opened. He walked out with a woman in her 50s, my daughter, who's been a support to her mother. "Zoe, this is Mrs. Harrington, one of our potential major donors." Mrs. Harrington said, "Your father has told me so much about your family's journey. It's generous of him to come back and care for you in your time of need." I thought, come back? He left his family for 8 years. Then I noticed a wedding band on his left hand. He hadn't mentioned remarrying to Maya or Zoe. After the woman left, I asked Zoe to wait in reception and confronted Dan about what she'd overheard and his wedding ring. He stopped smiling and spoke in a harsh voice. "You need to stay in your lane," he said, stepping close. "This foundation is happening with or without your approval. All you're doing is making Maya anxious with your constant suspicion." When I mentioned the photos and his comments about Maya looking sicker, he said, "That's just marketing. You think people donate based on happy stories? They don't. They donate based on guilt and emotion. I'm just playing the game." He accused me of trying to sabotage the foundation because I was threatened by his return. "You've been playing savior to my family for years," he said. "Can't handle being replaced, can you?" Zoe came back in crying. "Please stop fighting," she said. "I just want us to be a family again. Why does everything have to be so complicated?" Dan hugged Zoe and comforted her, then looked at me. The drive home was quiet at first. I didn't want to criticize her father, but I was worried about what she'd witnessed. "I want to believe in him," she said, "but some things don't add up. He told Mrs. Harrington he left pharmaceuticals to start the foundation, but he told me he was in real estate before this. And why is he wearing a wedding ring sometimes but not others?" I felt sorry for her. She's only 16 but noticing these details. Now I'm torn about whether to show her the evidence I've gathered about Dan's past failed ventures. Part of me thinks she deserves to know the truth, but another part wonders if it's fair to put her in that position with her father. Sorry for the long post, but this situation is overwhelming. Edit. Some people have asked about Maya's financial situation. She receives disability benefits and has a small income from freelance graphic design work she does on her good days. I've been helping with expenses when needed, but she's generally able to cover basics. Dan hasn't contributed any money since reappearing. He borrowed $200 from Maya last week for foundation printing costs. That hasn't been repaid. I'll try to respond to comments, but might be delayed as I've got a meeting with Maya's lawyer tomorrow morning, without Maya knowing. Not sure if that's the right move, but I need professional advice about this foundation situation. Thanks for your insights. They helped me when I was doubting myself. Now for the final update. The foundation fraud has been shut down. Thank you to everyone who commented on my previous posts. Your support helped me find the courage to address this situation. It's been almost 2 weeks since my last update. The meeting with Maya's lawyer turned out to be more important than I could have imagined. He looked over the foundation documents I brought and immediately identified multiple legal issues that raised serious red flags. Shout out to the commenters who told me to follow the money. You were correct. After our meeting, the lawyer connected me with a friend who specializes in investigating financial fraud. The investigator examined records and sent me an anonymous email with financial statements showing that Dan had been paying himself a consulting fee of $8,000 per month from the initial donations. The foundation had raised nearly $50,000 in its first month, but almost none of it was going toward MS support programs. I was furious, but tried to stay level-headed. It's not easy when someone's taking advantage of your sister's illness. The investigator also discovered that the major donor Dan introduced to me and Zoe was actually his current wife. They were staging interactions to create the impression of outside support for the foundation. I decided it was time for a family meeting. I texted Maya asking if I could come over that evening to discuss some concerns. She agreed, but mentioned Dan would be there too. I forwarded the financial documents to my email so I could print them if needed, and drove to Maya's place. When I arrived, Dan was sitting at the kitchen table with Maya. He had a stack of papers in front of him and was pointing at a signature line. It was a power of attorney document that would give him control over Maya's health-related decisions. He was pressuring her to sign immediately, claiming it was necessary for a grant application due that day. "This just needs your signature, and we can submit everything today," he said. "The foundation can't move forward without proper authorization." I asked to review the document. Thank you to everyone who warned me about legal papers. Dan became agitated, saying there was no time and accusing me of always interfering in their family matters. That's when I knew I had to act. I placed the financial documents on the table and asked Dan to explain why he was paying himself $8,000 a month from donations while Maya had seen no benefits. Dan demanded to know how I had obtained what he called private foundation documents and tried to gather the papers before Maya could see them. But Maya had already picked up one of the statements and started reading. The confusion and betrayal on her face was clear as she realized what she was seeing. "What is this, Dan?" she asked. "You said the money was going toward Zoe's college fund and MS research," Dan said. "No one will believe a sick woman's accusations. You signed those foundation documents without reading them, remember?" I turned to see Zoe standing in the hallway with her phone held up. She'd been recording the entire exchange. When Dan saw her, he lunged toward her, reaching for the phone. I stepped between them immediately. "Don't touch her," I said. "Your wife has already been contacted with the same documentation. How do you think she'll feel about funding your fake charity while you're playing happy family with your ex?" He knew he'd been caught. He tried one more angle, turning to Zoe. "Honey, you know I came back for you. This is all a misunderstanding your aunt created because she's jealous of our relationship." Zoe held up her phone. "I've been recording everything since you asked Mom to sign those papers. I'm not a little kid anymore, Dad." Maya, who had been reading more of the documents, looked up and said, "I want you to leave our home and our lives. My lawyer already knows about the foundation's misrepresentation, and he'll be contacting the proper authorities." Dan grabbed his coat, stormed out, and slammed the door. After he left, Maya apologized for not listening to my concerns earlier and thanked me for protecting them. Zoe joined us at the table, and we sat together in silence. The aftermath has been intense but positive. The foundation has been shut down pending investigation, and Dan is facing potential fraud charges. Maya's lawyer is pursuing back child support payments plus damages for misuse of her image and story. We've learned that several of the donors were unaware of how their money was being used and have joined the complaint against Dan. Zoe has been resilient through all of this. She told me that while she's sad about who her father turned out to be, she's grateful to know the truth rather than building a relationship on lies. She's also started volunteering with a legitimate MS organization. Maya's health has improved since the stress of Dan's manipulation was removed. Her neurologist commented on her improved test results at her appointment yesterday. She's working with a therapist to process everything that happened and has started reconnecting with friends. As for me, I'm relieved that this chapter is closing. The three of us are planning a weekend trip to the beach next month. Edit. I'm overwhelmed by your messages of support and can't respond to everyone individually. To address the most common questions. Yes, Dan's current wife has filed for divorce after discovering his deception. The foundation's remaining funds have been transferred to a legitimate MS organization, and Dan's previous charities are now under investigation as well. As for pursuing legal action for his attempt to intimidate me, I'm focusing on supporting Maya and Zoe right now, but haven't ruled it out. This community gave me strength when I was doubting my instincts about Dan's sudden reappearance and questionable foundation. I promise to pay it forward whenever I can, especially when someone posts about trusting their gut when something feels wrong.